100 Years of Solitude, Gabriel García Márquez. Many years later, facing the firing squad, Colonel Orleano Buendia was to remember that remote afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. Macondo was then a village of 20 houses of mud and canabrava built on the banks of a river with diaphanous waters that rushed through a bed of polished, white and enormous stones. Every year during the month of March, a family of ragged gypsies pitched their tent near the village and unveiled new inventions. First they brought the imam. He went from house to house dragging 2 metal ingots, and everyone was shocked when they saw that the cauldrons, the pans, the tongs, and the stoves fell from their places. José Arcadio Buendia, whose wild imagination always went further than the ingenuity of nature and even beyond miracles and magic, thought it was possible to use that useless invention to unravel gold from the earth. Márquez, who was an honest man, warned him, "That's not good for that." But José Arcadio Buendia at that time did not believe in the honesty of the gypsies, so he traded his mule and a bunch of goats for the 2 magnetized ingots. For several months he endeavored to prove the correctness of his conjectures. The only thing he managed to unearth was a 15th-century suit of armor with all its parts welded together by a piece of rust. When José Arcadio Buendia and the 4 men of his expedition managed to dismantle the armor, they found inside a calcified skeleton that had a copper reliquary with a woman's curl hanging around its neck. In March the gypsies returned. This time they carried a spyglass and a magnifying glass the size of a drum. They seated a gypsy woman at one end of the village and installed the spyglass at the entrance to the tent. By paying 5 reis, people looked through the spyglass and saw the gypsy at their fingertips. One hot noon they did an amazing demonstration with the gigantic magnifying glass. They put a pile of dry grass in the middle of the street and set it on fire by concentrating the sun's rays. José Arcadio Buendia, who still had not finished consoling himself for the failure of his imams, conceived the idea of using that invention as a weapon of war. Márquez, once again, tried to dissuade him. But he ended up accepting the magnetized ingots and 3 pieces of colonial money in exchange for the magnifying glass. Trying to demonstrate the effects of the magnifying glass on the enemy troops, he exposed himself to the concentration of the sun's rays and suffered burns that turned into ulcers and took a long time to heal. He spent long hours in his room, making calculations about the strategic possibilities of his novel weapon, until he managed to compose a manual of amazing didactic clarity and irresistible power of conviction. He sent it to the authorities accompanied by numerous testimonies about his experiences and several sheets of explanatory drawings. For several years he waited for the answer. Finally, tired of waiting, he complained to Márquez about the failure of his initiative, and the gypsy then gave a convincing proof of honesty. He returned the doubloons in exchange for the magnifying glass, and also left him some Portuguese maps and various navigational instruments. In his own handwriting he wrote a brief summary of the studies of the monk Herman, which he left at his disposal so that he could use the astrolabe, the compass, and the sextant. José Arcadio Buendia spent the long months of rain shut up in a little room that he built at the back of the house so that no one would disturb his experiments. He spent entire nights in the patio watching the course of the stars, and was on the verge of contracting sunstroke for trying to establish an exact method to find noon. When he became an expert in the use and management of his instruments, he had a notion of space that allowed him to navigate unknown seas, visit uninhabited territories and establish relationships with splendid beings. That was the time when he got into the habit of talking to himself. Walking around the house without paying attention to anyone, while Ursula and the children broke their backs in the garden taking care of the banana and the malanga, the cassava and the yam, the awima and the eggplant. Suddenly, without warning, his feverish activity was interrupted and replaced by a kind of fascination. He spent several days as if under a spell, repeating to himself in a low voice a string of amazing conjectures. Finally, one Tuesday in December, at lunchtime, he dropped the full burden of his torment in one fell swoop. And he revealed his discovery to them: the earth is round like an orange. Ursula lost patience. "If you have to go crazy, go by yourself," he shouted. "But don't try to instill your gypsy ideas in the children." He gathered the men of the town in the small room and showed them, with theories that were incomprehensible to all, the possibility of returning to the starting point by always sailing east. The whole village was convinced that José Arcadio Buendia had lost his mind, when Márquez arrived to put things right for him. And as a token of his admiration he gave him a gift that was to have a decisive influence on the future of the village, an alchemy laboratory. By that time, Márquez had aged with amazing rapidity. It was, in reality, the result of multiple rare diseases contracted on his countless trips around the world. He survived pellagra in Persia, scurvy in the Malayan archipelago, leprosy in Alexandria, beriberi in Japan, bubonic plague in Madagascar, the earthquake in Sicily, and a massive shipwreck in the Strait of Magellan. But despite his immense wisdom and his mysterious scope, he had a human weight, an earthly condition that kept him entangled in the minuscule problems of everyday life. He complained of old age ailments, suffered from the most insignificant economic mishaps, and had stopped laughing long ago because scurvy had knocked out his teeth. The rudimentary laboratory was composed of a primitive athanure, a glass cylinder with a long, narrow neck, and a distiller built by the gypsies themselves according to modern descriptions of the three-armed alembic of Mary the Jewess. In addition to these things, Melchiades left samples of the 7 metals corresponding to the 7 planets, the formulas of Moses and Zosimo for bending gold, and a series of notes and drawings on the processes of the Grand Magisterium, which allowed anyone who knew how to interpret them attempt to make the philosopher's stone. Seduced by the simplicity of the formulas for doubling gold, José Arcadio Buendía courted Ursula for several weeks so that she would allow him to dig up her colonial coins and increase them as many times as it was possible to subdivide quicksilver. Ursula yielded, as always happened. Then José Arcadio Buendía threw 30 doubloons into a saucepan and melted them down with scraped copper, orpiment, sulfur, and lead. He boiled everything over high heat in a cauldron of castor oil until he obtained a thick and pestilent syrup. Ursula's precious inheritance was reduced to a charred pork rind that could not be dislodged from the bottom of the cauldron. When the gypsies returned, Ursula had biased the entire population against them. But curiosity was stronger than fear. So everyone went to the tent, and by paying a penny they saw a youthful Melchiades, recovered, unwrinkled, with new and radiant teeth. All turned to panic when Melchiades pulled out his teeth, intact, set in his gums, and showed them to the audience for a moment and put them back in and smiled again with full mastery of his restored youth. Even José Arcadio Buendía himself experienced a healthy joy when the gypsy explained to him alone the mechanism of his false teeth. That seemed to him at the same time so simple and prodigious, that overnight he lost all interest in alchemical investigations. He suffered a new crisis of bad mood, he did not eat regularly again and he spent the day walking around the house. Those who had known him since the time of the founding of Macondo were amazed at how much he had changed under the influence of Melchiades. At the beginning, José Arcadio Buendía was a kind of youthful patriarch, who gave instructions for planting and advice for raising children and animals, and collaborated with everyone, even in physical work, for the smooth running of the community. Since his house was from the first moment the best in the village, the others were arranged in his image and likeness. Ursula's industriousness was on a par with that of her husband. Active, petite, severe. In a few years, Macondo was a more orderly and industrious village than any known until then by its 300 inhabitants. It was truly a happy village, where no one was older than 30 and where no one had died. From the time of the foundation, José Arcadio Buendia built traps and cages. In a short time he filled with turpials, canaries, bluebirds, and robins. That spirit of social initiative disappeared in a short time, swept away by the fever of magnets, astronomical calculations, dreams of transmutation and the desire to discover the wonders of the world. From being enterprising and clean, José Arcadio Buendia became a lazy-looking man, careless in his dress, with a wild beard that Ursula could hardly square with a kitchen knife. There were those who considered him the victim of some strange spell. But even those most convinced of his madness left work and families to follow him, when he shouldered his dismantling tools, and asked for everyone's help to open a trail that would put Macondo in contact with the great inventions. José Arcadio Buendia was completely ignorant of the geography of the region. In his youth, he and his men, with women and children and animals and all kinds of household goods, crossed the mountains looking for an outlet to the sea, and after 26 months they gave up the company and founded Macondo so as not to have to undertake the way back. According to the calculations of José Arcadio Buendia, the only possibility of contact with civilization was the northern route. He tossed his navigational instruments and maps of himself into a backpack, and set out on the reckless adventure. They descended the stony bank of the river to the place where years before they had found the warrior's armor, and there they entered the forest along a path of wild orange trees. Then, for more than 10 days, they did not see the sun again. The ground became soft and moist, like volcanic ash, and the vegetation became more and more insidious. For a week, almost without speaking, they advanced like sleepwalkers through a universe of sorrow, only illuminated by a faint reverberation of luminous insects. They couldn't return, because the path they were opening as they passed closed again in a short time, with new vegetation that they could almost see growing before their eyes. Always keeping an eye on the compass, he continued to guide his men towards the invisible north, until they managed to get out of the enchanted region. Exhausted from the long journey, they hung up their hammocks and slept soundly for the first time in 2 weeks. When they woke up, with the sun already high, they were stunned with fascination. In front of them, surrounded by ferns and palm trees, white and dusty in the silent morning light, was a huge Spanish galleon. Slightly turned to starboard. The discovery of the galleon, an indication of the proximity of the sea, broke the momentum of José Arcadio Buendia. He considered it a mockery of his mischievous destiny to have sought the sea without finding it, at the price of countless sacrifices and hardships, and then to have found it without looking for it, standing in his way like an insurmountable obstacle. Many years later, Colonel Orleano Buendia crossed the region again, and the only thing he found of the ship was the charred rib cage in the middle of a field of poppies. Only then, convinced that the story had not been a figment of his father's imagination, did he wonder how the galleon had gotten this far onto dry land. But José Arcadio Buendia did not consider that concern when he found the sea, after another 4 days of travel, 12 kilometers away from the galleon. His dreams ended in front of that ash-colored sea, foamy and dirty, which did not deserve the risks and sacrifices of his adventure. Damn. The scream dash. Macondo is surrounded by water on all sides. The idea of a peninsular Macondo prevailed for a long time. We'll never get anywhere, he lamented to Ursula. Here we have to rot in life without receiving the benefits of science. That certainty, ruminated over for several months in the little laboratory room, led him to conceive the project of moving Macondo to a more suitable place. But this time, Ursula anticipated his feverish designs. José Arcadio Buendia did not know at what moment, nor by virtue of what adverse forces, his plans became entangled in a tangle of pretexts, setbacks, and evasions, until they became a pure and simple illusion. Since no one wants to leave, we will go alone. Ursula did not change. We're not leaving, he said. Here we stay, because here we have had a son. If it is necessary for me to die for them to stay here, I will die. Instead of thinking about your crazy romances, you should take care of your children, he replied. Look how they are, abandoned to the good of God, just like donkeys. He looked out the window and saw the 2 barefoot children in the sunny orchard, and he had the impression that only at that moment had they begun to exist, conceived by Ursula's spell. Well, he said. Tell them to come help me get things out of the drawers. José Arcadio, the oldest of the children, had turned 14. Although he carried the same drive for growth and physical strength, even then it was evident that he lacked imagination. He was conceived and given birth during the painful crossing of the mountains, before the foundation of Macondo. Orellano, the first human being to be born in Macondo, was going to be 6 years old in March. He was silent and withdrawn. So it had always been, oblivious to the existence of his children, partly because he regarded childhood as a period of mental inadequacy, and partly because he was always too absorbed in his own fanciful speculations. But from the afternoon he called the children to help him unpack the things in the lab, he dedicated his best hours to them. He taught them to read and write and do math, and he told them of the wonders of the world not only as far as he knew, but stretching the limits of his imagination to unbelievable extremes. This is how the children ended up learning that in the southernmost part of Africa there were men so intelligent and peaceful that their only entertainment was to sit and think. Those amazing sessions were so imprinted in the memory of the children that many years later, a second before the regular army officer gave the order to fire the firing squad, Colonel Orellano Buendia relived the warm March afternoon when his father interrupted the physics lesson, and he stood fascinated, with his hand in the air and his eyes unmoving, hearing in the distance the fifes and drums and rattles of the gypsies that once again arrived at the house village, heralding the latest amazing discovery of the wise men of Memphis. They were new gypsies. Young men and women who knew only their own language, with their colorfully painted parrots reciting Italian ballads, and the hen that laid 100 golden eggs to the sound of the tambourine, and the trained monkey that divined thoughts. In an instant they transformed the village. The inhabitants of Macondo suddenly found themselves lost in their own streets, stunned by the massive fair. José Arcadio Buendia was like a madman looking for Melchiades everywhere, so that he would reveal the infinite secrets of that fabulous nightmare. The gypsy enveloped him in the astonished climate of his gaze, before turning into a puddle of stinking, smoky tar on which the resonance of his reply floated. Melchiades died. The children were not interested in the news. They were stubborn that their father would take them to see the marvelous novelty of the wise men of Memphis. They insisted so much that José Arcadio Buendia paid the 30 reals and led them to the center of the tent. Inside there was only an enormous transparent block, with infinite internal needles in which the brightness of the twilight broke up into colored stars. Puzzled, knowing that the children expected an immediate explanation, José Arcadio Buendia dared to murmur, "It's the largest diamond in the world." "No," corrected the gypsy. "It's ice." Intoxicated by the evidence of the prodigy, at that moment he forgot the frustration of his delusional undertakings and that of Melchiades' body and exclaimed, "This is the great invention of our time." When the pirate Francis Drake attacked Riohacha in the 16th century, Ursula Iguaran's great-grandmother was so frightened by the sound of the alarm bell and the blast of the cannons that she lost control of her nerves and sat down on a burning stove. Her burns left her a useless wife for life. She never walked in public again. She renounced all kinds of social habits obsessed by the idea that her body gave off a singed smell. Her husband, an Aragonesa merchant with whom she had 2 children, spent half a store on medicine and entertainment looking for a way to alleviate her terrors. Finally, he liquidated the business and took the family to live far from the sea, in a rancheria of peaceful Indians located in the foothills of the Sierra. A Creole tobacco grower, Don José Arcadio Buendia, lived in the hidden rancheria for a long time, with whom Ursula's great-grandfather established such a productive partnership that in a few years they made a fortune. Several centuries later, the Creole's great-great-grandson married the Aragonese's great-great-granddaughter. That's why every time Ursula got out of control with her husband's madness, she jumped over 300 years of coincidences, and she cursed the time Francis Drake robbed Riohacha. In truth they were bound to death by a bond more solid than love, a common remorse of conscience. They were cousins. To each other. They were afraid that those healthy tales of two races that had been intertwined for centuries would go through the embarrassment of breeding iguanas. José Arcadio Buendia, with the lightness of his 19 years, solved the problem with a single sentence: "I don't mind having little pigs, as long as they can talk." Fearing that her corpulent and willful husband would rape her in her sleep, Ursula put on rudimentary pants before going to bed that her mother made for her with sailboat canvas and reinforced with a system of criss-cross straps, which closed in front with a thick iron buckle. They went like this for several months. He spread the rumor that Ursula was still a virgin a year after her marriage, because her husband was impotent. So the situation remained the same for another 6 months, until the tragic Sunday when José Arcadio Buendia won a cockfight against Prudencio Aguilar. Furious, excited by the blood of his animal, the loser moved away from José Arcadio Buendia so that the entire cockfight could hear what he was going to tell him. "I congratulate you," he shouted. "Let's see if that rooster finally does your wife a favor." José Arcadio Buendia serenely picked up his rooster. "I'll be right back," he told everyone. And then to Prudencio Aguilar, "And you, go home and arm yourself, because I'm going to kill you." 10 minutes later she returned with her grandfather's primed spear. At the door of the cockpit, where half the town had gathered. Prudencio Aguilar was waiting for him. He had no time to defend himself. José Arcadio Buendia's spear, thrown with the force of a bull, pierced his throat. José Arcadio Buendia entered the bedroom when his wife was putting on her chastity pants. Brandishing her spear in front of her, he ordered, "Take that off." Ursula did not question her husband's decision. "You will be responsible for what happens," she murmured. José Arcadio Buendia stuck the spear into the dirt floor. "If you have to give birth to iguanas, we'll raise iguanas," he said. "But there will be no more deaths in this town because of you." It was a good June night, cool and with a moon, and they were awake and frolicking in bed until dawn, indifferent to the wind that passed through the bedroom, heavy with the tears of Prudencio Aguilar's relatives. The affair was classified as a duel of honor, but both of them had an uneasy conscience. One night when she couldn't sleep, Ursula went out to drink water in the patio and saw Prudencio Aguilar next to the jar. She trying to blind the hole in her throat with an esparto plug. She went back into the room to tell her husband what she had seen, but he ignored her. "The dead don't come out," she said. "What happens is that we cannot bear the weight of conscience." 2 nights later, Ursula saw Prudencio Aguilar again in the bathroom, washing the crystallized blood from his neck with the esparto plug. Another night she saw him walking in the rain. José Arcadio Buendia, annoyed by his wife's hallucinations, went out into the courtyard armed with a spear. There was the dead man with his sad expression. "Go to hell," José Arcadio Buendia yelled at him. "As many times as you come back I will kill you again." Prudencio Aguilar did not leave, nor did José Arcadio Buendia dare to throw the spear. Since then she couldn't sleep well. He was tormented by the immense desolation with which the dead man had looked at him from the rain. One night when she found him washing his wounds in his own room, José Arcadio Buendia could not resist any longer. "It's all right, Prudencio," he told him. "We will leave this town, as far as we can, and we will never return. Now go easy." That was how they started the crossing of the mountains. Several friends of José Arcadio Buendia, young people like him, excited by the adventure, dismantled their houses and loaded with their wives and children towards the land that no one had promised them. The only thing Ursula took with her was a trunk with her newlywed clothes, a few household items, and the little chest with the gold pieces that she inherited from her father. It was an absurd trip. At 14 months, with her stomach ravaged by monkey meat and snake broth, Ursula gave birth to a son with all her human parts. She had traveled half the way in a hammock hanging from a pole that 2 men carried on their shoulders, because the swelling disfigured her legs, and her varicose veins burst like bubbles. Although it was pitiful to see them with warm bellies and languid eyes, the children endured the journey better than their parents, and enjoyed it most of the time. One morning, after almost 2 years of crossing, they were the first mortals to see the western slope of the mountain range. But they never found the sea. One night, after several months of wandering lost in the swamps, far from the last Indians they encountered on the road, they camped on the banks of a rocky river whose waters seemed like a torrent of frozen glass. Years later, during the Second Civil War, Colonel Orellano Buendia tried to follow that same route to take Riohacha by surprise, and after 6 days of travel he understood that he was crazy. However, the night they camped by the river, his father's hosts looked like castaways without escape, but their numbers had increased during the journey and they were all willing, and succeeded, to die of old age. José Arcadio Buendia dreamed that night that a noisy city with mirror-walled houses was rising in that place. The next day he convinced his men that they would never find the sea. He ordered them to cut down the trees to make a clearing by the river, in the coolest place on the bank, and there they founded the village. José Arcadio Buendia was unable to decipher the dream of houses with mirrored walls until the day he discovered ice. He then believed he understood its profound meaning. He thought that in the near future blocks of ice could be made on a large scale, from such an everyday material as water, and the new houses of the village could be built with them. Macondo would cease to be a burning place, whose hinges and latches twisted from the heat, to become a winter city. If he did not persevere in his attempts to build an ice factory, it was because then he was positively enthusiastic about the education of his children, especially that of Orellano, who had revealed from the first moment a rare alchemical intuition. The lab had been dusted. Reviewing Melchiad's notes, serenely now, without the exaltation of the novelty, in long and patient sessions they tried to separate Ursula's gold from the rubble adhering to the bottom of the cauldron. The willful firstborn, always too big for his age, grew into a monumental teenager. He changed his voice. One night Ursula entered the room when he was taking off his clothes to sleep, and she experienced a confused feeling of shame and pity. He was the first man she had seen naked, after her husband, and he was so well equipped for life that she seemed abnormal. At that time a cheerful, foul-mouthed, provocative woman came to the house, who helped with the housework and knew how to read the future in the deck. Ursula told him about her son. He thought that her disproportion was something as unnatural as the cousin's pigtail. The woman let out an expansive laugh that reverberated through the house like a trail of glass. On the contrary, she said. Be happy. To confirm her prognosis, she brought the cards home a few days later. Suddenly she reached out and touched it. How great, she said, genuinely scared, and that was all she could say. José Arcadio felt that her bones were filled with foam, that he had a languid fear and a terrible desire to cry. The woman made no advance. But José Arcadio kept looking for her all night in the smell of smoke that she had in her armpits and that got stuck under her skin. He wanted to be with her at all times, he wanted her to be her mother, to never leave the barn and to tell her how barbaric. One day he couldn't take any more of her and he went looking for her at her house. He made a formal, incomprehensible visit, sitting in the room without saying a word. At the time he didn't want her. That night, in the horror of her vigil, he desired her again with brutal anxiety. Days later, unexpectedly, the woman called him at her house, where she was alone with her mother, and she made him go into the bedroom under the pretext of teaching her a card trick. She then touched him so freely that he was disappointed after the initial shudder, feeling more fear than pleasure. She asked him to go look for her that night. He went out into the street asleep. He wished with all his heart that the door was barred, and not just tightened, as she had promised him. But it was open. From the moment he walked in, sideways and trying not to make a sound, he smelled the scent. In the narrow room his mother slept, another daughter with her husband and 2 children, and the woman who perhaps was not expecting him. He would have been able to go by the smell if the smell hadn't been all over the house. He remained motionless for a long time, when a hand with all fingers extended, which he was feeling in the darkness, bumped into his face. Then he entrusted himself to that hand, and in a terrible state of exhaustion he allowed himself to be carried to a formless place where they took off his clothes and shook him. In an unfathomable darkness in which his arms were too many, where he no longer smelled of a woman, but of ammonia, and where he tried to remember her face and found himself with Ursula's face. And feeling that he could no longer resist the icy noise of his kidneys and the air of his guts, and the fear, and the giddy desire to flee at the same time to remain forever in that exasperated silence and that frightful solitude. She was called Pilar Ternera. She had been part of the exodus that culminated in the founding of Macondo, dragged along by her family to separate her from the man who raped her at the age of 14 and continued to love her until she was 22, but who never decided to make the situation public because he was someone else. He promised to follow her to the end of the world, but later, when he settled his affairs, and she was tired of waiting for him. Waiting for her, she had lost the strength of her thighs, the hardness of her breasts, the habit of tenderness, but she kept intact the madness of her heart. During the day, collapsing with sleep, she secretly reveled in the memories of the night before. But when she entered the house, he didn't have to make any effort to hide her tension. He was so lost in thought that he didn't even understand everyone's joy when his father and his brother stirred up the house with the news that they had managed to breach the metal rubble and separate the gold from Ursula. From showing it so much, he ended up in front of his eldest son, who in recent times had barely appeared in the laboratory. He put the dry and yellowish lump in front of his eyes and asked him, "What do you think?" Jose Arcadio answered honestly, "Dog shit." His father gave him a violent blow to the mouth with the back of her hand that brought blood and tears to his eyes. That night Pilar Ternera put arnica compresses on the swelling. They achieved such a state of intimacy that a moment later, without realizing it, they were speaking in whispers. "I want to be alone with you," he said. "One of these days I tell everyone everything and the hiding places are over." "That would be very nice," he said. "If we're alone, we leave the lamp on to see each other well, and I can shout all I want without anyone having to get in the way and you whisper in my ear all the crap you can think of." Spontaneously, without any preparation, he told his brother everything. Little by little he became contaminated with anxiety. He waited for him awake until dawn, so that very soon they both suffered the same drowsiness, felt the same contempt for alchemy and his father's wisdom, and took refuge in solitude. One Thursday in January, at 2 in the morning, Amaranta was born. Before anyone entered her room, Ursula examined her thoroughly. In her mother's room, playing with her newborn sister and with a face that fell from her innocence, she found Jose Arcadio. Ursula had barely completed her 40-day rest when the gypsies returned. They were the same mountebanks and jugglers who carried the ice. This time, among many other tricks, they carried a flying mat. Protected by the delicious impunity of the collective disorder, Jose Arcadio and Pilar lived hours of relief. They were 2 happy lovers among the crowd, and they even came to suspect that love could be a more restful and profound feeling than the wild but momentary happiness of their secret nights. Pilar, however, broke the spell, mistook the form and the occasion, and with a single blow she threw the world on top of her. "Now you are a man, you are going to have a son." Jose Arcadio did not dare to leave his house for several days. It was enough for him to hear Pilar's tremulous laughter in the kitchen to run to take refuge in the laboratory. One afternoon the boys were thrilled by the flying mat that sped past the laboratory window level carrying the gypsy driver and several village children who waved merrily. He couldn't escape his concern. He lost his appetite and sleep, he succumbed to a bad mood, just like his father when one of his companies failed, and his disorder was such that Jose Arcadio Buendia himself relieved him of his duties in the laboratory, believing that he had taken up alchemy. Too chesty. He had lost the old spontaneity of him. From accomplice and communicative he became hermetic and hostile. Longing for solitude, bitten by a virulent rancor against the world. One night he got out of bed as usual, but he didn't go to Pilar Ternera's house, but to blend in with the tumult of the fair. He noticed something that was not at stake, a very young gypsy, almost a girl, overwhelmed with beads, the most beautiful woman José Arcadio had ever seen in his life. He had pushed his way through the crowd to the front row where the gypsy was, and had stopped behind her. She pressed against her back. The girl tried to get away from her, but José Arcadio pressed harder against her back. Then she felt it. She froze against him, trembling with shock and awe, unable to believe the evidence, and at last she turned her head and looked up at him with a tremulous smile. José Arcadio and the girl went to her tent, where they kissed with desperate anxiety as they took off their clothes. However, José Arcadio could not answer him because they were in a kind of public tent, where the gypsies passed with their circus things and arranged their affairs. A gypsy woman with splendid flesh entered shortly after, accompanied by a man who was not part of the show business, but who was not from the village either, and they both began to undress in front of the bed. Without meaning to, the woman looked at José Arcadio and examined with a kind of pathetic fervor her magnificent animal in repose. "Boy," she exclaimed, "may God keep her." The passion of the others aroused José Arcadio's fever. It was Thursday. On Saturday night, José Arcadio tied a red cloth around his head and left with the gypsies. When Ursula discovered his absence, she searched for him throughout the village. Ursula asked where the gypsies had gone. He kept asking in the way they indicated, and believing that he still had time to catch up with them, he kept going away from the village, until he became aware of being so far away that he no longer thought of returning. José Arcadio Buendia did not discover his wife's absence until 8 o'clock at night. In a few hours he gathered a group of well-equipped men, put a maranta in the hands of a woman who offered to breastfeed her, and got lost along invisible paths in after Ursula. After 3 days of futile searching, they returned to the village. On a certain occasion, Pilar Ternera offered to do the chores around the house while Ursula returned. Orleano, whose mysterious intuition had been sensitized by her misfortune, experienced a flash of clairvoyance when he saw her enter. He knew that in some inexplicable way she was to blame for her brother's elopement and her mother's consequent disappearance, and he harassed her in such a way, with a quiet and implacable hostility, that the woman did not. He went back to the house. Time put things in his place. José Arcadio Buendia and his son did not know when they were back in the laboratory dusting off. On a certain occasion, months after Ursula's departure, strange things began to happen. An empty jar long forgotten in a cupboard became so heavy that it was impossible to move. A pan of water placed on the work table boiled without fire for half an hour until it completely evaporated. Suddenly, almost 5 months after his disappearance, Ursula returned. She arrived elated, rejuvenated, in new clothes of a style unknown in the village. José Arcadio Buendia could barely resist the impact. But she didn't share her elation. She gave him a conventional kiss, as if she hadn't been gone more than an hour, and said, "Come to the door." They were not gypsies. They were men and women like them, with straight hair and brown skin, who spoke the same language and lamented the same pain. Ursula had not reached the gypsies, but she found the route that her husband could not discover in his frustrated search for the great inventions. Pilar Ternera's son was taken to his grandparents' house when he was 2 weeks old. Ursula admitted it reluctantly, defeated once again by her husband's stubbornness that she could not tolerate the idea that an offshoot of her blood would be drifting, but she imposed the condition that it hide from the child her true identity. Although he received the name of José Arcadio, they ended up simply calling him Arcadio to avoid confusion. At that time there was so much activity in the town and so much bustle in the house, that the care of the children was relegated to a secondary level. They entrusted them to Visitation, a Guajira Indian who came to town with a brother. That was how Arcadio and Amaranta spoke the Guajira language before Spanish, and learned to drink lizard broth and eat spider eggs without Ursula realizing it. The people who arrived with Ursula spread the good quality of its soil and its privileged position with respect to the swamp, so that the simple village of another time soon became an active town, with shops and craft workshops, and a permanent trade route where the first Arabs arrived with slippers and rings in their ears, exchanging glass necklaces for macaws. José Arcadio Buendia did not have a moment of rest. Fascinated by an immediate reality that was then more fantastic than the vast universe of his imagination, he lost all interest in the alchemical laboratory. He acquired such authority among the newcomers that no foundations were laid or fences erected without consulting him, and it was determined that he should direct the division of the land. When the gypsy mountebanks returned, now with their traveling fair transformed into a gigantic establishment for games of luck and chance, they were received with joy because it was thought that José Arcadio was returning with them. But José Arcadio did not return, so the gypsies were not allowed to settle in the town or set foot in it again in the future. José Arcadio Buendia, however, was explicit in the sense that the ancient tribe of Melquiades, who contributed so much to the aggrandizement of the village with their ancient wisdom and fabulous inventions, would always find the doors open. But the tribe of Melquiades, according to the Globetrotters, had been erased from the face of the earth for having exceeded the limits of human knowledge. Emancipated at least for the moment from the tortures of fantasy, José Arcadio Buendia in a short time imposed a state of order and work, within which only one license was allowed, the release of the birds that from the time of the foundation cheered the time with their flutes, and the installation in their place of musical clocks in all the houses. It was also José Arcadio Buendia who decided in those years that almond trees should be planted in the streets of the town instead of acacias. Many years later, when Macondo was a camp of wooden houses with zinc roofs, broken and dusty almond trees still remained in the oldest streets. Orleano lived endless hours in the abandoned laboratory, learning the art of silversmithing through pure research. He had stretched himself out so much, he started wearing his father's clothes. Adolescence had taken the sweetness out of his voice and made him silent and definitely lonely. Arcadio and Amaranta, who had already begun to change their teeth and still clung to the Indians' blankets all day. Orleano fixed her with a look that enveloped her in a sphere of uncertainty. "Someone is coming," he told her. On Sunday, in fact, Rebecca arrived. She was no more than 11 years old. She had made the arduous journey from Manor with some fur dealers who were commissioned to deliver her along with a letter to the house of José Arcadio Buendia. All of her luggage was made up of the clothes trunk, a small wooden rocking chair with colorful hand-painted flowers, and a canvas bag that made a permanent cluck-cluck-cluck noise, where she carried the bones of the parents of she. The letter addressed to José Arcadio Buendia was written in very affectionate terms by someone who continued to love him very much despite time and distance and who felt compelled by an elementary sense of humanity to show him the charity of sending him that poor helpless orphan, who was cousin of Ursula in the second degree and therefore also a relative of José Arcadio Buendia, although to a more distant degree, because she was the daughter of that unforgettable friend who was Nicanor Ulloa. And his very worthy wife Rebecca Montiel, whom God had in his holy kingdom, whose remains were attached to this so that they could be given a Christian burial. But neither José Arcadio Buendia nor Ursula remembered having relatives with those names, much less in the remote town of Manor. From the moment he arrived he sat sucking his thumb in the rocker and watching everyone with his big frightened eyes, without giving any sign of understanding what they were asking him. Her green skin, her round belly taut as a drum, revealed ill health and hunger older than herself. They stayed with her because there was no other choice. They decided to call her Rebecca. It was a long time before Rebecca joined family life. They couldn't get her to eat for several days. No one understood how she hadn't starved to death. But they discovered that Rebecca only liked to eat the damp earth from the patio and the lime cakes that she tore off the walls with her fingernails. Since then she has been subjected to relentless surveillance. They threw cow gall on the patio and smeared hot chili pepper on the walls, believing they could defeat her pernicious vice with these methods. Ursula was forced to use more drastic resources. She put orange juice with rhubarb in a saucepan that she left overnight, and gave him the potion the next day on an empty stomach. Ursula supplemented the treatment with strapping. In a few weeks, Rebecca began to show signs of recovery. She participated in Arcadio and Amaranta's games, who welcomed her like an older sister, and she ate heartily, using her cutlery well. It was soon revealed that she spoke Spanish as fluently as the language of the Indians. They soon considered her as a member of her family. One night, around the time that Rebecca was cured of the vice of eating dirt and was taken to sleep in the other children's room, the Indian woman who slept with them woke up by chance and heard a strange intermittent noise in the corner. She saw Rebecca in the rocker, sucking on her thumb and with her eyes lit up like a cat's in the dark. Visitation de Ella recognized in those eyes the symptoms of the disease whose threat had forced her and her brother to banish themselves forever from a 1,000-year-old kingdom in which they were princes. It was the plague of insomnia. The Indian woman explained to them that the most fearsome thing about the disease of insomnia was not the impossibility of sleeping, since the body did not feel any tiredness, but its inexorable evolution towards a more critical manifestation, forgetfulness. It meant that when the patient got used to his waking state, the memories of childhood began to fade from his memory, then the name and the notion of things, and finally the identity of people and even the consciousness of his own being, to the point of sinking into a kind of idiocy without a past. But Ursula, just in case, took the precaution of separating Rebecca from the other children. After several weeks, José Arcadio Buendia found himself tossing and turning in bed one night without being able to sleep. They were not alarmed until the third day, when at bedtime they felt sleepless, realizing that they had not slept for more than 50 hours. "The children are awake too," the Indian woman said with her fatalistic conviction. "Once he enters the house, no one escapes the plague." Ursula prepared and made everyone drink a concoction of monkshood, but they couldn't sleep. Instead they spent the whole day daydreaming. In that state of hallucinated lucidity they not only saw the images of their own dreams, but also saw the images dreamed by the others. It was as if the house had been filled with visitors. Meanwhile, due to an oversight that José Arcadio Buendia never forgave himself, the candy animals made at home continued to be sold in town. Children and adults sucked with delight at the delicious little green roosters of insomnia, the exquisite pink fish of insomnia and the cute little yellow horses of insomnia, so that Monday dawn surprised the whole town awake. At first no one was alarmed. On the contrary, they were glad not to sleep, because then there was so much to do in Macondo that there was hardly enough time. They worked so hard, that soon they had nothing else to do. When José Arcadio Buendía realized that the plague had invaded the town, he gathered the heads of families to explain to them what he knew about insomnia, and measures were agreed to prevent the scourge from spreading to other towns. The swamp. All the foreigners who walked the streets of Macondo at that time had to ring their bell so that the sick would know that they were healthy. They were not allowed to eat or drink anything during their stay. So effective was the quarantine, that the day came when the emergency situation was considered a natural thing, and life was organized in such a way that work regained its rhythm and no one again worried about the useless habit of sleeping. It was Orellano who conceived the formula that would defend him for several months from the evasions of memory. But a few days later he discovered that he had difficulty remembering almost everything in the lab. He then marked them with the respective name, so that it was enough for him to read the inscription to identify them. And later he imposed it on all the people. He realized that there might come a day when things would be recognized by their inscriptions, but their usefulness would not be remembered. So he was more explicit. At the entrance to the road to the swamp they had put up a sign that said Macondo and another larger one on the street that said God exists. In all the houses, keys had been written to memorize objects and feelings. But the system required so much vigilance and moral fortitude that many succumbed to the spell of an imaginary reality, invented by themselves, that was less practical but more comforting. Pilar Ternero was the one who contributed the most to popularize this mystification, when she conceived the artifice of reading the past in the decks as she had previously read the future. José Arcadio Buendía then decided to build the memory machine that he had once wanted to remember the marvelous inventions of the gypsies. The device was based on the possibility of reviewing every morning, and from the beginning to the end, all the knowledge acquired in life. He imagined it as a rotating dictionary that an individual located on the axis could operate by means of a crank, so that in a few hours the most necessary notions for living passed before his eyes. He had managed to write about 14,000 cards, when a strange old man with the sad bell of the sleepers appeared along the path of the swamp. He was a decrepit man. Although his voice was also cracked by uncertainty and his hands seemed to doubt the existence of things, it was clear that he came from the world where men could still sleep and remember. José Arcadio Buendía greeted him with ample displays of affection, fearing that he had known him in another time and now would not remember him. But the visitor saw the falsity of him. He felt forgotten, not with the irremediable forgetfulness of the heart, but with another more cruel and irrevocable forgetfulness that he knew very well, because it was the forgetfulness of death. He gave José Arcadio Buendía a substance of a calm color to drink, and the light was made in his memory. His eyes moistened with tears, before he saw himself in an absurd room where objects were marked, and even before he recognized the newcomer in a dazzling blaze of joy. It was Melquiades. The gypsy was willing to stay in the village. He had been in death, indeed, but he had come back because he couldn't bear the loneliness. Disowned by his tribe, deprived of any supernatural faculty as punishment for his fidelity to life, he decided to take refuge in that corner of the world not yet discovered by death, dedicated to the exploitation of a daguerreotype laboratory. José Arcadio Buendía had never heard of that invention. But when he saw himself and his entire family embodied in an eternal age on a sheet of litmus metal, he was dumbstruck. It was Ursula who forgot her old grudges against him and decided that Melquiades would stay living in the house, although she never allowed them to make a daguerreotype of her. In the family daguerreotype, the only one that ever existed, Orellano appeared dressed in black velvet between Amaranta and Rebecca. He had the same languor and the same clairvoyant gaze that he was to have years later before the firing squad. But he still hadn't felt the premonition of his fate. In the workshop that he shared with Melquiades' crazy laboratory, he could hardly be heard breathing. That consecration to work, the good judgment with which he managed his interests, had allowed Orellano to earn more money in a short time than Ursula with his delicious caramel fauna, but everyone was surprised that he was already a full-fledged man and no woman would have known him. Months later Francisco El Hombre returned, an elderly globe-trotter almost 200 years old who frequently passed through Macondo spreading the songs composed by himself. In them, Francisco the man recounted in minute detail the news that occurred in the towns on his itinerary. That was how Ursula found out about the death of her mother, by pure chance, one night when she was listening to her songs in the hope that they would say something about her son, José Arcadio. Francisco El Hombre, so called because he defeated the devil in an improvised song duel, and whose real name no one knew, disappeared from Macondo during the plague of insomnia and one night reappeared unannounced in Caterino's store. The whole town went to listen to him to find out what had happened in the world. Orellano listened to the news until the end without finding any that interested his family. He was about to head home when the matron waved a hand at him. "You come in too," he told her. "It only costs 20 cents. Orellano dropped a coin into the piggy bank that the matron had on her legs and entered the room without knowing why. The teenage mulatto girl, with her bitch tits, was naked on the bed. Before Orellano, that night, 63 men had passed through the room. When the girl finished making the bed and ordered him to get undressed from it, Orellano undressed, tormented by modesty, unable to shake the idea that his nakedness did not stand up to comparison with his brother. Despite her efforts, he felt more and more indifferent, and terribly alone. 2 years before, very far from there, she had fallen asleep without blowing out the candle and had woken up surrounded by the fire. The house where she lived with the grandmother who had raised her was reduced to ashes. Since then, the grandmother took her from town to town, putting her to bed for $20 to pay for the value of the burned house. According to the girl's calculations, he still lacked about 10 years of 70 men per night, because he also had to pay the travel and food expenses for both of them and the salary of the Indians who carried the rocking chair. When the matron knocked on the door a second time, Orleano left the room without having done anything, stunned by the desire to cry. That night he couldn't sleep thinking about the girl, with a mixture of desire and commiseration. He felt an irresistible need to love her and protect her. At dawn, exhausted by her insomnia and fever, he made the serene decision to marry her to free her from her grandmother's despotism and to enjoy her nightly satisfaction that she gave to 70 men. But, the girl had left town. Time placated her giddy purpose, but aggravated her sense of frustration. He took refuge in work. He resigned himself to being a man without a woman all his life to hide the shame of his worthlessness. Meanwhile, Melquiades finished capturing everything that could be captured in Macondo on his plates, and left the daguerreotype laboratory to the delirium of José Arcadio Buendia, who had decided to use it to obtain scientific proof of the existence of God. Melquiades delved into the interpretations of Nostradamus. One night he thought he had found a prediction about the future of Macondo. It would be a luminous city, with large glass houses, where no trace of the Buendia lineage remained. It's a mistake, José Arcadio Buendia thundered. They will not be houses of glass but of ice, as I dreamed, and there will always be a Buendia, forever and ever. In that extravagant house, Ursula struggled to preserve common sense, having expanded the business of candy animals with an oven that produced baskets and baskets of bread and a prodigious variety of puddings, meringues, and biscuits all night long. She was so busy she was in her prosperous enterprises, that one afternoon she looked absently into the courtyard, and she saw two unknown and beautiful teenagers. They were Rebecca and Amaranta. They had barely taken off their grandmother's mourning, which they kept with inflexible rigor for 3 years, and the colored clothes seemed to have given them a new place in the world. Rebecca, contrary to what she might have expected, was the most beautiful. Next to them, although she already revealed the physical drive of her father, Arcadio looked like a child. He had dedicated himself to learning the art of silversmithing with Orleano, who had also taught him to read and write. Ursula suddenly realized that the house had filled with people, that her children were about to get married and have children, and that they would be forced to spread out for lack of space. She then took out the money accumulated in long years of hard work, made commitments with her clients, and undertook the expansion of the house. She arranged for a formal room to be built for visitors, another more comfortable and cool room for daily use, a dining room for a table with 12 seats where the family would sit with all their guests, 9 bedrooms with windows to the patio and a long corridor. He arranged to build in the patio, in the shade of the chestnut tree, a bathroom for the women and another for the men, and at the back a large stable. The new house was almost finished when Ursula took him out of his chimerical world to inform him that he had ordered the facade to be painted blue, and not white as they wanted. "Who is this guy?" he asked. "The magistrate," said Ursula disconsolately. "They say that he is an authority who sent the government. His first provision was to order that all houses be painted blue to celebrate the anniversary of national independence. In this town we don't rule with papers," he said without losing his calm. "And just so you know once and for all, we don't need any correctors because there's nothing to correct here." He was not hurt that the government had not helped them. On the contrary, she was glad that until then he had let them grow up in peace, and she hoped that he would continue to leave them that way, because they had not founded a town so that the first upstart would tell them what to do. "So if you want to stay here, like another ordinary citizen, you're very welcome," José Arcadio Buendia concluded. "But if he comes to make a mess by forcing people to paint their house blue, he can grab his corrados and go back where he came from." Don Apolinar Moscote turned pale. He took a step back and clenched his jaw to say with a certain sorrow, "I want to warn you that I am armed." José Arcadio grabbed Don Apolinar Moscote by the lapel and lifted him up to eye level with him. "I do this," he told her, "because I'd rather carry him alive than have to keep carrying him dead for the rest of my life." So he carried it down the middle of the street, suspended by the lapels, until he put it on its 2 feet in the path of the swamp. A week later he was back with 6 barefoot and ragged soldiers armed with shotguns. He installed the family in the Hotel de Jacob, while he got a house, and reopened the office protected by the soldiers. The founders of Macondo resolved to expel the invaders, but he was opposed, as he explained, because Don Apolinar Moscote had returned with his wife and his daughters, and it was not a thing for men to embarrass others in front of his family. So he decided to fix the situation for good. Unarmed, ignoring the guard, they entered the mayor's office. Don Apolinar Moscote did not lose his composure. He introduced them to two of his daughters who happened to be there, Amparo, 16 years old, dark like her mother, and Remedios, just 9 years old, a beautiful girl with lily skin and green eyes. "Very well, friend," José Arcadio Buendia said, "you stay here, but not because you have those bandits with blunderbusses at the door, but out of consideration for your wife and his daughters. We only put 2 conditions on it," he added. "The first, that everyone paints their house the color they want. The second, that the soldiers leave immediately. We guarantee order. Word of honor?" "Word of enemy," said José Arcadio Buendia. And he added in a bitter tone, "because I want to tell you one thing, you and I are still enemies." That same afternoon the soldiers left. A few days later José Arcadio Buendia got a house for the corregidor's family. Everyone was at peace, except Orellano. The image of Remedios, the corregidor's youngest daughter, who because of her age could have been his daughter, left him hurting somewhere in his body. The new house, white as a dove, was inaugurated with a dance. Ursula had conceived that idea since the afternoon she saw Rebecca and Amaranta turned into teenagers. The importing house sent an Italian expert, Pietro Crespi, at its own expense, to assemble and tune the pianola, instruct buyers in its handling and teach them to dance to the fashionable music printed on 6 rolls of paper. Pietro Crespi was young and blonde, the most beautiful and best educated man Macondo had ever seen. That day the Italian had lunch with them. Rebecca and Amaranta, serving the table, were intimidated by the fluidity with which that angelic man with pale hands and no rings handled the cutlery. In the living room, adjoining the visiting room, Pietro Crespi taught them to dance. He indicated the steps without touching them, marking the beat with a metronome, under the kind supervision of Ursula. Pietro Crespi wore in those days special pants, very flexible and tight, and dance shoes. "You don't have to worry so much," José Arcadio Buendia told his wife. "This man is a queer." But she did not give up the surveillance while she did not finish the apprenticeship and the Italian did not leave Macondo. Then the organization of the party began. Ursula made a strict list of the guests, in which the only ones chosen were the descendants of the founders, except for Pilar Ternera's family, who had already had 2 other children of unknown parents. José Arcadio Buendia renounced the pursuit of the image of God, convinced of its non-existence, and disemboweled the player piano to decipher its secret magic. The house was opened, still smelling of resins and damp lime, and the children and grandchildren of the founders discovered the corridor of ferns and begonias. Bitter was Ursula's disappointment when he placed the first roll for Amaranta and Rebecca to open the dance, and the mechanism didn't work. José Arcadio Buendia finally managed to move a jammed device by mistake, and the music came out first in spurts, and then in a fountain of convoluted notes. Pietro Crespi returned to compose the player piano. The day before his trip, a dance was improvised with the restored player piano to bid him farewell, and he did a virtuoso demonstration of modern dance with Rebecca. But the exhibition was interrupted because Pilar Ternera, who was at the door with the onlookers, got into a fight biting and pulling her hair with a woman who dared to comment that young Arcadio had a woman's buttocks. Around midnight, Pietro Crespi said goodbye with a sentimental little speech and promised to return very soon. Rebecca accompanied him to the door, and after closing the house and turning off the lamps, she went to her room to cry. Those secret tastes, once defeated by oranges and rhubarb, burst into irrepressible longing as she began to cry. He went back to eating dirt. She would put handfuls of earth in her pockets, and she would eat them in granules without being seen. One afternoon, for no reason, Amparo Moscote asked permission to see the house. 2 hours later, when the conversation was beginning to languish, Amparo took advantage of Amaranta's oversight and handed Rebecca a letter. Written with the same methodical handwriting, the same green ink and the same precious disposition of the words with which the pianola's operating instructions were written. The sudden friendship of Amparo Moscote and Rebecca Buendia aroused Aureliano's hopes. The memory of little Remedios hadn't stopped torturing him, but he couldn't find a chance to see her. Shortly after, indeed, he heard her little childish voice. Remedios approached and asked some questions about the little fish, which Aureliano couldn't answer because a sudden asthma prevented him. He couldn't do anything except tell Remedios that she was going to give him the little fish, and the girl was so frightened by her offer that she left the workshop in a hurry. That afternoon Aureliano lost the hidden patience with which he had waited for the chance to see her. He neglected work. He called her many times, in desperate efforts to concentrate, but Remedios didn't answer. The house was filled with love. Aureliano expressed it in verses that had no beginning or end, and in all of them Remedios appeared transfigured. Rebecca was waiting for love at 4 in the afternoon, embroidering by the window. She knew that the mail mule did not arrive but every fortnight. But once the mule did not arrive on the scheduled date. Mad with desperation, Rebecca got up at midnight and ate handfuls of dirt in the garden with suicidal avidity, crying with pain and fury, chewing on tender earthworms and chipping her teeth with snail bones. She vomited until dawn. She sank into a state of feverish prostration, lost consciousness, and her heart burst open in shameless delirium. Orleano was the only one capable of understanding such desolation. That afternoon, while Ursula tried to rescue Rebecca from the mangrove swamp of delirium, he went with Magnifico Vispal and Gerinaldo Márquez to Caterino's store. Caterino put a hand on his back and told him, "It's going to be 11 o'clock." Orleano turned his head, saw the enormous disfigured face with a felt flower in his ear, and then he lost his memory, and he recovered it again in a strange morning and in a room that was completely strange to him, where Pilar Ternera was in combination, barefoot, disheveled, lighting him with a lamp and stunned with disbelief. "Aurelian. I'm here to sleep with you," he said. Her clothes were smeared with mud and vomit. She carried him to bed. He cleaned her face with a damp cloth, took off her clothes, and then he undressed completely and lowered the mosquito net so that her children would not see her if they woke up from her. He had grown tired of waiting for the man who stayed, for the men who left. Waiting for him, her skin had cracked, her breasts had emptied, the embers in her heart had gone out. He looked for Orleano in the dark, put his hand on his belly and kissed his neck with maternal tenderness. "My poor little boy," he murmured. Aurelian shuddered. With calm dexterity, without the slightest stumble, he left behind the cliffs of pain and found Remedios turned into a swamp without horizons, smelling of raw animals and freshly ironed clothes. When he surfaced he was crying. Then Pilar Ternera asked him, "Who is she?" And Orleano told him. She let out a laugh. "You'll have to finish raising her," he taunted her. Pilar Ternera had made him a spontaneous promise. "I'm going to talk to the girl," he told her, "and you'll see that I'll serve her to you on a platter." She complied. But at a bad time, because the house had lost the peace of other days. Upon discovering Rebecca's passion, which she was unable to keep secret because of her screaming, Amaranta suffered a fever attack. She, too, suffered from the thorn of a lonely love. Ursula barely managed to attend to the two sick women. Finally, in another moment of inspiration, she forced the lock on the trunk and found the letters bound with pink ribbons, addressed and never sent to Pietro Crespi. Crying with fury, she cursed the moment it occurred to her to buy the player piano, prohibited embroidery classes and decreed a kind of mourning without death that was to last until the daughters gave up their hopes for her. So when Pilar Ternera told Orleano that Remedios was determined to get married, he understood that the news would end up afflicting her parents. But he coped with the situation. Summoned to the visiting room for a formal interview, José Arcadio Buendia and Ursula listened impassively to their son's statement. Upon learning the bride's name, however, José Arcadio Buendia blushed with indignation. "Love is a plague," he thundered. "With so many pretty and decent girls, the only thing you can think of is to marry the enemy's daughter." But Ursula agreed with the choice. José Arcadio Buendia then set a condition: Rebecca, who was the reciprocated, would marry Pietro Crespi. Ursula would take Amaranta on a trip to the capital of the province, when she had time, so that her contact with people different from her would alleviate her disappointment. Rebecca recovered her health as soon as she found out about the deal, and she wrote her boyfriend a jubilant letter which she submitted to her parents' approval and she mailed without the help of intermediaries. Amaranta pretended to accept her decision and little by little she recovered from her fever, but she promised herself that Rebecca would marry only by stepping over her corpse. The following Saturday, José Arcadio Buendia went to ask for Remedios Moscote's hand. They asked Remedios if she was really determined to get married, and she replied whimpering that she just wanted to be allowed to sleep. José Arcadio Buendia confirmed that, indeed, Remedios was the chosen one. "That doesn't make sense," said Don Apolinar Moscote, dismayed. "We have 6 more daughters, all single and of an age to deserve, who would be delighted to be worthy wives of serious and hard-working gentlemen like your son," and Orlito sets his eyes precisely on the only one who still wets the bed. When they finished drinking the fruit smoothie, they had accepted Aureliano's decision with pleasure. Except that Mrs. Moscote begged the favor of speaking alone with Ursula. Ursula went to visit her the next day. Half an hour later, she came back with the news that Remedios was prepubescent. Orleano did not consider it a serious setback. He had waited so long, that he could wait as long as necessary, until the bride was of childbearing age. The recovered harmony was only interrupted by the death of Melchiades. Although it was a foreseeable event, the circumstances were not. At first, José Arcadio Buendia seconded him in his tasks, enthusiastic about the novelty of the daguerreotype and the predictions of Nostradamus. But little by little he was abandoning him to his solitude, because communication was becoming more and more difficult for them. He was losing his sight and hearing, he walked feeling the air. One day he forgot to put on his false teeth, which he left in a glass of water by the bed at night, and he did not put them back on. When Ursula ordered the extension of the house, he had her build a special room next to Aureliano's workshop, away from the noise and the domestic hustle and bustle. The new place seemed to please Melchiades, because he was never seen again, not even in the dining room. He only went to Aureliano's workshop, where he spent hours and hours scribbling his enigmatic literature. Lately he lost his appetite and ate only vegetables. He soon took on the look of helplessness typical of vegetarians. His skin was covered with a tender moss. Aureliano ended up forgetting about him, absorbed in writing his verses, but on a certain occasion he thought he understood something of what he was saying in his murmuring monologues, and he paid attention to him. In fact, the only thing he could isolate in the stony ramblings was the insistent hammering of the word equinox equinox equinox, and the name of Alexander von Humboldt. One afternoon, however, he seemed lit up with sudden emotion. Years later, facing the firing squad, Arcadio would have to remember the tremor with which Melquiades made him listen to several pages of his impenetrable writing, which of course he did not understand, but when read aloud they seemed like sung encyclicals. Then he smiled for the first time in a long time and said in Spanish, "When I die, burn mercury for 3 days in my room." Arcadio told José Arcadio Buendia, and the latter tried to obtain more explicit information, but he only got one answer: "I have achieved immortality." When Melquiades' breath began to smell, Arcadio took him to bathe in the river on Thursday mornings. He seemed to improve. "We are from the water," he once said. So a long time passed without anyone seeing him in the house. One Thursday, Aureliano heard him say, "I died of fever in the dunes of Singapore." That day he got into the water by a bad way and they did not find him until the next morning, several kilometers below. José Arcadio Buendia opposed being buried. "He is immortal," he said, and he himself revealed the formula of the resurrection. He revived the forgotten Athener and put a cauldron of mercury to boil next to the corpse, which little by little was filling with blue bubbles. He completed the 72 hours of mercurial incense when the corpse was already beginning to burst into a livid bloom, whose faint hisses filled the house with a pestilential vapor. He only then allowed himself to be buried. They buried him in a tomb erected in the center of the land that was destined for the cemetery, with a tombstone where the only thing that was known about him was written, Melquiades. They made his 9 nights of wake. In the crowd that gathered in the patio to drink coffee, tell jokes and play cards, Amaranta found an opportunity to confess her love to Pietro Crespi, who a few weeks before had formalized her engagement to Rebecca. The Italian treated Amaranta like a capricious little girl who was not worth taking too much into account. Ella Amaranta felt humiliated and she told Pietro Crespi, with a virulent rancor, that she was willing to prevent her sister's wedding even if she had to walk through the door with her own corpse. The Italian was so impressed with the drama of her threat that he couldn't resist the temptation to discuss it with Rebecca. That was how Amaranta's trip was arranged in less than a week. Ella Amaranta did not resist, but when she gave Rebecca her goodbye kiss, she whispered in her ear, "Don't flatter yourself. Even if they take me to the end of the world, I'll find a way to stop you from getting married, even if I have to kill you." With Ursula's absence, with the invisible presence of Melquiades who continued his stealthy wandering through the rooms, the house seemed huge and empty. Rebecca had been left in charge of housekeeping, while the Indian woman took care of the bakery. At dusk, when Pietro Crespi arrived preceded by a fresh breath of lavender and always carrying a toy as a gift. Those visits filled the house with wonderful toys. The rich and amazing mechanical fauna carried by Pietro Crespi dissipated José Arcadio Buendia's affliction over Melquiades' death, and transported him back to his old days as an alchemist. He lived then in a paradise of disemboweled animals, of undone mechanisms, trying to perfect them with a system of continuous movement based on the principles of the pendulum. Aureliano, for his part, had neglected the workshop to teach little Remedios to read and write. Aureliano's patience and devotion ended up seducing her, to the point that she spent many hours with him studying the meaning of the letters and drawing. Only Rebecca was unhappy with Amaranta's threat. In search of relief from her anxiety, she called Pilar Ternera so that she could read her future. Pilar Ternera predicted, "You won't be happy while your parents remain unburied." Rebecca was so concerned with her enigma that she told José Arcadio Buendia about it and he reprimanded her for believing deck forecasts, but she took on the silent task of looking for her bag of bones. After several days of auscultation, with their ears against the walls, they perceived the deep clock. They drilled through the wall and there were the bones in the bag intact. That same day they buried him in an improvised tomb without a headstone next to Melquiades, and José Arcadio Buendia returned home freed from a burden that for a moment weighed as much on his conscience as the memory of Prudencio Aguilar. Passing through the kitchen, he kissed Rebecca on the forehead. "Get the bad ideas out of your head," he told her. "You will be happy." Rebecca's friendship opened the doors of the house to Pilar Ternera, closed by Ursula since Arcadio's birth. Sometimes she would enter the workshop and help Arcadio to sensitize the daguerreotype plates with an efficiency and tenderness that ended up confusing him. She was stunned by that woman. On a certain occasion Aureliano was there, working in goldsmithing, and Pilar Ternera leaned on the table to admire her patient industry. "Well," Aureliano said. "Tell me what it is." Pilar Ternera bit her lips with a sad smile. That you're good for war, he said. Where you put the eye you put the lead. Orleano returned to concentrating on his work, as if nothing had happened, and his voice acquired a calm firmness. I admit it, he said. It will bear my name. José Arcadio Buendia finally got what he was looking for. He connected the clock mechanism to a wind-up dancer, and the toy danced without interruption to the beat of his own music for 3 days. He did not eat again. He didn't go back to sleep. Without Ursula's vigilance and care, he allowed himself to be dragged by his imagination into a state of perpetual delirium from which he would never recover. The fever of insomnia exhausted him so much that one morning he could not recognize the old man with the white head and uncertain gestures that he entered his bedroom. It was Prudencio Aguilar. When he finally identified it, amazed that the dead also grew old. After many years of death, the longing for the living was so intense, the need for company so pressing, the proximity of the other death that existed within death so terrifying, that Prudencio Aguilar had ended up loving the worst of his enemies. A few hours later, worn out by the vigil, he entered Aureliano's workshop and asked him, "What day is today?" Orleano answered that it was Tuesday. "That's what I thought," said José Arcadio Buendia. "But suddenly I realized that it is still Monday, like yesterday. Look at the sky, look at the walls, look at the begonias. Also today is Monday." Accustomed to his hobbies, Orleano paid no attention to him. The next day, Wednesday, José Arcadio Buendia returned to the workshop. "This is a disaster," he said. "Look at the air, hear the drone of the sun, just like yesterday and the day before yesterday. Also today is Monday." That night, Pietro Crespi found him in the corridor, crying with the graceless little cry of old people, crying for Prudencio Aguilar, for Melquiades, for Rebecca's parents, for his father and his mother. On Thursday he reappeared in the workshop with a painful look of scorched earth. "The time machine has broken down," he almost sobbed, "and Ursula and Amaranta are so far away." Orleano scolded him like a child and he adopted a submissive air. On Friday, before anyone else was up, he again watched the appearance of nature, until he had no doubt that it was still Monday. Then he grabbed the bar of a door and with the savage violence of his colossal strength he smashed to dust the alchemy equipment, the daguerreotype cabinet, the goldsmith's workshop. He was about to finish off the rest of the house when Orleano asked the neighbors for help. It took 10 men to knock him down, 14 to tie him up, 20 to drag him to the chestnut tree in the patio, where they left him tied up, barking in a strange language and foaming green at the mouth. When Ursula and Amaranta arrived, he was still tied hand and foot to the trunk of the chestnut tree, soaked with rain and in a state of total innocence. They spoke to him, and he looked at them without recognizing them and said something incomprehensible. Orleano Buendia and Remedios Moscote got married on a Sunday in March. A month was set for the wedding. There was hardly time to teach her to wash herself, to dress herself, to understand the elementary matters of a home. It was an exhausting effort, but at the scheduled date of the ceremony the girl was as adept at the things of the world as any of her sisters. Orleano, dressed in black cloth, with the same patent leather ankle boots with metal hooks that he was to wear a few years later in front of the firing squad, was intensely pale and had a hard lump in his throat when he received his girlfriend at the door of the house and carried her to the altar. Her mother and her sisters suffered so much from the fear that the girl would do something wrong during the ceremony, that in the end they were the ones who committed the impertinence of picking her up to kiss her. From that day on, the sense of responsibility was revealed, the natural grace, the calm control that Remedios always had to have in the face of adverse circumstances. It was she who, on her own initiative, set aside the best portion that she had cut from the wedding cake and took it on a plate with a fork to José Arcadio Buendia. Tied to the trunk of the chestnut tree, huddled on a wooden bench under the palm shed. The only unhappy person in that noisy celebration that lasted until dawn on Monday was Rebecca Buendia. It was her frustrated party. By agreement with Ursula, her marriage was to be celebrated on the same date, but Pietro Crespi received a letter on Friday announcing the imminent death of his mother. The wedding was postponed. Pietro Crespi left for the capital of the province an hour after receiving the letter, and on the way he met his mother who arrived on time on Saturday night and sang the sad aria that she had prepared for the wedding at Aureliano's wedding of his son. Pietro Crespi returned at midnight on Sunday to sweep up the ashes of the party, after having killed 5 horses on the way trying to be in time for his wedding. It was never found out who wrote the letter. Tormented by Ursula, Amaranta wept with indignation and swore her innocence in front of the altar. Father Nicanor Reina, whom Don Apolinar Moscote had brought from the swamp to officiate at the wedding, was frightened by the aridity of the inhabitants of Macondo, who thrived on scandal, subject to natural law, without baptizing their children or sanctify the holidays. Thinking that no land lacked the seed of God so much, he decided to stay 1 more week to Christianize the circumcised and Gentiles, legalize concubinage and sacrament the dying. But nobody paid attention to him. They replied that for many years they had been without a cure, arranging the business of the soul directly with God, and had lost the malice of mortal sin. Tired of preaching in the desert, Father Nicanor set out to undertake the construction of a temple, the largest in the world. He went everywhere begging for alms with a copper saucer. They gave him a lot, but he wanted more. He begged so much, that he lost his voice. His bones began to fill with noises. One Saturday, not having collected even the value of the doors, he allowed himself to be overwhelmed by despair. He improvised an altar in the plaza, and on Sunday he toured the town with a little bell, as in times of insomnia, summoning the open-air mass. "One moment," he said. "Now we are going to witness irrefutable proof of the infinite power of God." The boy who had helped at mass brought him a cup of thick, steaming chocolate, which he downed without breathing. Then he wiped his lips with a handkerchief he took from his sleeve, spread his arms and closed his eyes. Then Father Nicanor rose 6 inches above ground level. It was a compelling resource. He walked for several days between the houses, repeating the test of levitation through the stimulation of chocolate, while the altar boy collected so much money in a bag, that in less than a month he undertook the construction of the temple. Nobody questioned the divine origin of the demonstration, except José Arcadio Buendia. He barely stretched out on the bench and shrugged when Father Nicanor began to rise from the ground along with the chair he was sitting on. "Nego," he said. "Factum hoc existentiam dei probat sine Diobio." "I deny it," he said. "This fact undoubtedly proves the existence of God." That was how it became known that the devilish jargon of José Arcadio Buendia was Latin. Father Nicanor took advantage of the fact that he was the only person who had been able to communicate with him, to try to instill faith in his disturbed brain. Every afternoon he sat by the chestnut tree, preaching in Latin, but José Arcadio Buendia demanded the daguerreotype of God as the only proof. He was so stubborn that Father Nicanor gave up evangelizing him and continued to visit him out of humanitarian sentiments. But then it was José Arcadio Buendia who took the initiative and tried to break the priest's faith with rationalist tricks. On a certain occasion when Father Nicanor brought the chestnut tree a board and a box of chips to invite him to play checkers, José Arcadio Buendia did not accept, according to what he said, because he could never understand the meaning of a contest between two adversaries who were in agreement. Agreement on principles. Father Nicanor, who had never seen the game of checkers that way, could not play it again. Increasingly amazed at José Arcadio Buendia's lucidity, he asked him how it was possible that they had him tied to a tree. "Hoc est simplicissimum," he replied, "because I'm crazy." Since then, worried about his own faith, the priest did not visit him again, and he devoted himself entirely to hastening the construction of the temple. Rebecca felt hope reborn. Her future was conditional on the completion of the work. "The luckiest will be Rebecca," said Amaranta. And since Rebecca didn't understand what she wanted to tell her, she explained it to her with an innocent smile. "She's going to have to inaugurate the church with your wedding." Ursula celebrated Amaranta's idea and contributed a considerable amount to speed up the work. Father Nicanor considered that with another aid like that, the temple would be ready in 3 years. "That way I won't have to kill you for the next 3 years." Rebecca accepted the challenge. When Pietro Crespi found out about the new postponement, he suffered a crisis of disappointment, but Rebecca gave him a definitive test of loyalty. "We'll elope when you decide," she told him. Pietro Crespi, however, was not a man of adventures. After 3 months of supervised love affairs, bored with the slow pace of construction that he stopped by to inspect every day, Pietro Crespi decided to give Father Nicanor the money he needed to finish the temple. Amaranta was not impatient. A miscalculation spoiled what he considered most effective, removing the mothballs that Rebecca had put on her wedding dress before putting it away in the bedroom dresser. The wedding was less than a month away, but Amparo Mascote promised to sew a new dress in a week. Amaranta felt faint that rainy noon when Amparo entered the house wrapped in foamy knitwear to make Rebecca the last fitting of her dress. She was sure that at the last moment, when all the resources of her imagination had failed, she would have the courage to poison her. She decided with appalling coolness that the date would be the last Friday before the wedding, and the mode would be a splash of laudanum in her coffee. A major obstacle, as insurmountable as it was unforeseen, forced a new and indefinite postponement. A week before the date set for the wedding, little Remedios woke up at midnight drenched in a hot broth that exploded in her entrails with a kind of heartbreaking belch, and died 3 days later poisoned by her own blood with a pair of twins crossed in the womb. Amaranta suffered a crisis of conscience. She had begged God so fervently that something terrible would happen so she wouldn't have to poison Rebecca, that she felt guilty for Remedios' death. This was not the obstacle that she had begged for so much. Remedios had brought a breath of joy into the house. She took on the costly task of caring for José Arcadio Buendia. She brought him food, assisted him with his daily needs, washed him. When the son of Orleano and Pilar Ternero was born and was brought to the house and baptized in an intimate ceremony with the name of Orleano José, Remedios decided that he should be considered her eldest son. Orleano, for her part, found in her the justification he needed to live. He worked all day in the workshop and Remedios brought him a cup of coffee without sugar at mid-morning. Both visited the Moscotes every night. Orleano played endless games of dominoes with his father-in-law, while Remedios talked with his sisters or dealt with elderly people's matters with his mother. The link between the Buendias consolidated the authority of Don Apolinar Moscote in the town. On frequent trips to the provincial capital, he got the government to build a school for Arcadio to attend. Through persuasion, he managed to get most of the houses painted blue for the National Independence Festival. So deep was the affection that he and his wife had managed to arouse in their family that when Remedios announced that she was going to have a son, even Rebecca and Amaranta made a truce to weave in blue wool, in case a boy was born, and in pink wool, in case she was born a woman. She was the last person Arcadio thought of. A few years later, in front of the firing squad, Ursula ordered a duel of closed doors and windows, with no entrance or exit for anyone except for essential matters. He forbade speaking out loud for a year, and placed Remedios' daguerreotype in the place where the corpse was laid, with a black ribbon and an oil lamp lit forever. Future generations, who never let the lamp go out, were to be disconcerted by this girl with curly skirts, little white boots and an organdy bow on her head, which they failed to match with the academic image of a great-grandmother. Amaranta took charge of Orleano Jose. She adopted him as a son who was to share her loneliness, and relieve her of the involuntary laudanum that her foolish pleas threw at her in the Remedios Cafe. The very idea of thinking of a new date for the wedding would have been so irreverent, that the courtship became an eternal relationship, a tired love that no one took care of again. Lost her way, completely demoralized, Rebecca went back to eating dirt. Suddenly, when the morning had been going on for so long that the cross-stitch sessions had resumed, someone pushed the front door at 2 in the afternoon. A huge man arrived. His square shoulders barely fit through the doors. He went straight to the kitchen, and there he stood for the first time at the end of a journey that had begun on the other side of the world. "Good," he said. Ursula stood for a fraction of a second with her mouth open, looked him in the eye, uttered a scream and jumped on his neck, screaming and crying with joy. It was Jose Arcadio. He came back as poor as he left, to the point that Ursula had to give him 2 pesos to pay the rent for the horse. He spoke Spanish mixed with sailor's jargon. They asked him where he had been, and he replied, "That way." He hung the hammock in the room assigned to him and slept for 3 days. When he woke up, and after downing 16 raw eggs, he went straight to Caterino's store. He made arm wrestling bets with 5 men at the same time. Caterino, who did not believe in devices of force, bet 12 pesos that the counter would not move. Jose Arcadio pulled him out of his place, raised him high on his head and put him in the street. It took 11 men to get it in. In the heat of the party he exhibited his unlikely masculinity on the counter, entirely tattooed with a blue and red tangle of signs in various languages. He asked the women who besieged him with their greed who paid more. The one with the most offered 20 pesos. Then he proposed to raffle among all of them at 10 pesos the number. But they all accepted. They wrote their names on 14 ballots that they put in a hat, and each woman took one out. When only 2 ballots remained to be drawn, it was established who they corresponded. 5 pesos more each, Jose Arcadio proposed, and I'll split it between the 2 of them. That's what he lived on. He had circled the world 65 times, enlisted in a crew of stateless sailors. The women who slept with him that night in Caterino's store took him naked to the dance room so they could see that he didn't have a millimeter of his body without tattoos. He couldn't join the family. He slept all day and spent the night in the Tolerance neighborhood doing strength tricks. On the few occasions that Ursula managed to seat him at the table, he showed signs of radiant friendliness, especially when he recounted his adventures in remote countries. He had been shipwrecked and had been adrift for 2 weeks in the Sea of Japan, feeding on the body of a companion who had succumbed to sunstroke. Deep down, Ursula couldn't conceive that the boy the gypsies took away was the same Atarvan who ate half a suckling pig for lunch and whose winds withered the flowers. Amaranta could not hide the disgust that her bestial belches produced in her at her table. Arcadio, who never knew the secret of her affiliation, barely answered the questions that he asked her with the evident purpose of conquering her affections. Orleano tried to relieve the times when they slept in the same room, but Jose Arcadio had forgotten them. Only Rebecca succumbed to the first impact. The afternoon she saw him pass in front of her bedroom, she thought that Pietro Crespi was a wimpy Carutico next to that Protomaco. He sought proximity to him on any pretext. On a certain occasion, Jose Arcadio looked at her body with shameless attention, and told her, "You're a very woman, little sister." Rebecca lost control of herself. She went back to eating earth and lime from the walls with the avidity of other days. She vomited a green liquid with dead leeches. She spent sleepless nights shivering with fever, fighting delirium, waiting, until the house shook with Jose Arcadio's return at dawn. One afternoon, when everyone was taking a nap, she couldn't resist any more and went to her bedroom. She found him in his underpants. "Come here," he said. Rebecca obeyed. "Oh, Little sister, oh, little sister. She had to make a supernatural effort not to die when an astonishingly regulated cyclonic power lifted her by her waist and stripped her of her privacy with 3 claws, tearing her to pieces like a baby bird. She managed to thank God for being born, before losing consciousness in the inconceivable pleasure of that unbearable pain. 3 days later they were married at 5 o'clock mass.